2 volumes this time.
The subcommittee will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting this morning to review the Coast Guard mission needs and report released by the GAO reviewing how the service allocates its resources. Under Section 2, Title 14, the Coast Guard is responsible for a wide range of missions, from search and rescue, icebreaking, and marine environmental protection to port security and drug interdiction. The Coast Guard uses a strategic planning process which determines mission priorities based on risk and helps guide the service in allocating resources among its statutory missions. GAO noted in its report that not all of the processes used by the service to allocate its resources have been transparent. And I actually went through some of the stuff, the M&S and some of the other things that you use in the Coast Guard to determine what gets used where and how many hours are allocated as opposed to how many hours are actually used. And it was very complicated. I'm not that smart enough to actually see through it. So we'll talk about that more today and maybe find a way to dumb it down so that us mere mortals can understand how the resources are allocated and what the top lines are and so forth. Okay, good. Maybe you could, but you can translate it to us, please, Ms. Grover. As the nation's primary maritime response organization, the Coast Guard often must surge assets and personnel to respond to a hurricane, oil spill, or other national or international emergency. As the service did on April 2010, it moved over 150 assets and 7,500 personnel to the Gulf Coast to lead response efforts to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. The Coast Guard is also tasked with preventing maritime accidents, keeping our borders secure, and protecting our ports and waterways. In fiscal year 2015, the service conducted over 12,000 safety, security, and environmental inspections of U.S. and foreign flag vessels and interdicted 6,000 undocumented migrants and 179 metric tons of illegal drugs. The Coast Guard works hard to meet its missions, and this subcommittee wants to ensure that the service retains its core competencies and acquires the assets needed for its response missions and day-to-day prevention work. However, it does seem at times that the service presents a rose-colored glasses view of the capabilities and capacities of its assets. This subcommittee also needs to understand where current assets may be failing to support the service's ability to meet its mission demands, and how the service then conducts risk assessment to move assets around to cover mission gaps when it may not be possible to cover those gaps and what missions are impacted. We'll talk specifically about icebreaking. We'll talk specifically about land-based UAVs, when we get into the hearing here. The GAO report notes that for the most part, Coast Guard assets are not reaching the allocated resource hours the service includes in its planning documents, and its field units are not uniformly tracking data to show what missions are being supported by the assets when in use. This is another thing we're going to, what I'd like your help on is this is how do we not bureaucratize the Coast Guard to where everybody's just simply filling out timesheets 24/7, trying to track what their assets are doing and when, so you can actually go out and do your missions, but at the same time, kind of present a real, call it a transparent or easily understandable view on what your assets are doing and how they're being allocated. There are a lot of moving parts to understand how the Coast Guard manages its resources. For those of us trying to support the service, the various documents, the mission needs statements, capital investment plan, and programs of record can be less than helpful in revealing how the information they provide flows into the annual budget requests and influence overall decisions on asset use and acquisitions. We here are your supporters. It should not be this difficult to unravel the needs of the service or to understand how existing assets are performing. The Coast Guard updated its mission needs statement in 2015, and I look forward to discussing how that mission needs statement will be used to establish an achievable asset acquisition plan. We have been at this, recapitalizing the service's assets since the late 1990s. John and I have been doing this for about, 4 years now, specifically here, while the complexities of the world continue to grow. We need to make sure the Coast Guard is at its most capable now more than ever. I look forward to having a frank discussion with our witnesses, and I thank you all for coming. With that, I yield to the ranking member, Mr. Garamundi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for scheduling this meeting to assess the Coast Guard's new mission needs statement and the implications of how the Coast Guard allocates its resources. I'd first like to extend my greetings to Vice Commandant of the Coast Guard, Admiral Charles Michel. Welcome. Delighted to see you and have a little conversation before we even started the meeting. And also welcome Jennifer Glover, from the Government Accounting Office, who can answer all the questions that the chairman just raised. Thank you very much for being here. Even the most junior boatswain mate can tell you, before you can accurately chart a course to arrive safely at any destination, you first need to have a reliable compass to give you an accurate heading. Well, is that what the mission needs statement provides for the Coast Guard? We're going to find out. Is it a reliable compass to guide them forward? We hope so, and we'll hear about it today. We can all agree that far too much time has elapsed between today and when the Coast Guard's last mission statement was developed in 2005. In many respects, the assumptions embedded in that analysis reflect a much different time and a much different Coast Guard. For example, the mix of assets available to the Coast Guard to meet its mission needs is now, the Coast Guard is now in the midst of the largest recapitalization effort in the service's history, including a whole bunch of new airplanes they didn't even know they'd ever get, like the 27s. Yet this transition is not without irony. For at a time when the Coast Guard is receiving the most modern and most capable assets in its 225-year history, missteps and delays in the acquisition of these assets have forced the Coast Guard to rely on its remaining legacy assets, which have become ever less reliable and ever more expensive to operate each year. So we hope the Coast Guard is prepared to get on with its future, with its new assets in a timely and appropriate cost way. Additionally, a changing global climate has accelerated the opening of the Arctic region. This circumstance has prompted new operational challenges for the Coast Guard while simultaneously creating a shifting, uncertain geopolitical environment for the Coast Guard to operate in. Most regrettably, the specter and reach of non-state terrorists or transnational criminal organizations continually place the Coast Guard in ever-grading demands to ensure the safety and security of the United States, our maritime commerce, as well as our people. And it's not just here in the Western Hemisphere, but it's globally. I had the pleasure of seeing some of the Coast Guard ships stationed in Qatar, or excuse me, Bahrain, when I visited there a few months ago. And so the Coast Guard has a new compass, the mission statement. We're going to explore that today. We know we must do our work to ensure that the Coast Guard uses this new analysis to best allocate its resources and for Congress to provide the support necessary to carry it out. So if the Coast Guard is semper paratus, so too must the Congress. Your 11 statutory missions are your guideposts. The mission statement is how you're going to get there. Mr. Chairman, thank you for scheduling the hearing. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank the ranking member. Let me introduce the witnesses. They're Vice Commandant Charles Michel. Admiral, congratulations on your recent promotion. And Ms. Jennifer Grover, Director of Homeland Security and Justice for the Government Accountability Office. And with that, Admiral, you're recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Garamendi, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to speak on behalf of the 88,000 men and women of the United States Coast Guard serving around the globe today. I ask that my written statement be accepted as part of the official record and I be allowed to summarize my remarks. This subcommittee has significantly advanced our long-term acquisition strategy and provided critical support for our Coast Guard men and women. Thank you for helping us build a 21st century Coast Guard capable of achieving national objectives wherever American maritime interests may lie. We are operating in both polar regions where human activity is increasing dramatically, particularly in the Arctic. We are managing emerging cyber challenges in our maritime industry. We are combating transnational organized crime throughout our own hemisphere, and we are keeping pace with changes in the commercial maritime industry to ensure that we facilitate and not impede the vitally important industry that we regulate. Notably, our increased efforts, along with those of our interagency and international partners, are contributing to significant disruptions against organized criminal networks, to include the detention of over 700 smugglers and over 190 metric tons of cocaine bound for the United States in 2015. And I just got the latest figures here. This year, we and our partners are on a record pace, having already disrupted over 245 metric tons and detained 391 more narco traffickers, and they told me the projections would be that we're likely to see a 400-plus metric ton disruption year, and we can talk about the reasons for that. I just got those figures this morning, sir, from my intel folks. In very real terms, we are taking billions of dollars from the hands of illicit cartels, and each interdiction contains a treasure trove of intelligence that we can use to exploit the gaps and seams in criminal networks that lead to even more seizures and arrests. Intelligence drive operations like they never have before, and we can talk a little bit about that, sir. And these successful interdictions do far more than just remove drugs from the stream of commerce. Dismantling criminal networks reinstates the rule of law, curtails violence, and brings needed stability to Central America. The widespread violence in our own hemisphere is directly related to illegal migration on our southern border, as we saw in 2014 when over 68,000 unaccompanied minors arrived in the United States. To be sure, our own national security is challenged by cartel syndicates operating well inside our homeland from Texas to New England and everywhere in between. Removing cocaine at sea strikes directly at their financial supply lines, and it remains vitally important that we continue to fight this fight. The appropriation you provided in 2016 and the President's budget request in 2017 will allow us to move forward with recapitalization of our over 50-year-old medium endurance cutters with the offshore patrol cutter. We are confident that we will down select to a single shipbuilder and award OPC detailed design by the end of this fiscal year. Turning to the far north, Cutter Healy began a deployment just last week to the Arctic, where she will further United States sovereignty interests by collecting seabed data that will directly support any U.S. extended continental shelf claim. This is an area potentially twice the size of the state of California. We are tremendously grateful for the President's commitment to building new heavy icebreakers and for your support to get us through the critical design phase we are now undertaking. We look forward to continuing to work with you to accelerate heavy icebreaker acquisition. We have provided a Coast Guard mission needs statement, and we are undertaking an updated fleet mix analysis that will take into account operational data, technological advancements, and new assets like the C-27J that Representative Garamendi mentioned, and a 9th national security cutter that were not available during our last analysis. I look forward to sharing those results with you as we work forward to determining the composition of our surface and air fleets. As important as these new platforms may be, investing in a 21st century Coast Guard is as much about people as it is about ships, boats, and aircraft. Our 2017 budget request recognizes the critical importance of building the workforce of the future. This is not without challenges. Though we have the best workforce in Coast Guard history, we are seeing the impact of decreased retention and slowed accessions. Our increasingly uncertain and complex world requires high-end skill sets from an in-demand talent pool. Cyber, intelligence, marine inspection, and other technically trained professionals have many options today, and we strive to be their employer of choice. I look forward to this committee's continued support of our Coast Guard. Again, I thank you and look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Admiral. Same here. Ms. Grover, you're recognized.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, other members and staff. As the Admiral noted, the Coast Guard, like other organizations, is only as good as its people and assets. During our work, we find the service members of the Coast Guard to be consistently hardworking and talented. But one of the challenges facing the Coast Guard is making sure that it has the right mix of assets deployed to the right missions at the right times to best equip its people to carry out those missions. My statement today will focus on 2 points. First, a call for the Coast Guard to make tough decisions about the mix of assets that it needs and can afford in today's budget environment. And second, recognition that the Coast Guard is taking steps to enhance the effectiveness of its strategic asset allocation process, which will help ensure that its limited assets are deployed effectively and as intended. First, regarding those tough decisions about an effective, realistic mix of assets for today. The 2007 baseline stands as the official record of the Coast Guard's plan for its intended asset mix. Yet it does not reflect the mix of assets that the Coast Guard has acquired since then. Since the baseline was developed, the Coast Guard has received additional assets beyond those planned, such as the C-27Js and a 9th NSC, and some planned assets have been delayed or reconsidered, such as the unmanned aerial vehicles and the full component of the HC-144 aircraft. Also, the Coast Guard's understanding of its asset capabilities has evolved. In several cases, planned capabilities have been revised downward to reflect more realistic operational targets. For example, the fast response cutters are now expected to operate at 2,500 hours per year, not 3,000. As a result of the delays in acquisitions and reduced operational capacities, the actual resource hours that were used during FY15 fell short of what was originally planned for every asset type. For example, in 2015, a mix of legacy and new patrol cutters used 48% of the resource hours that were specified in the baseline. In addition, the cost of the acquisition portfolio has grown far beyond original expectations, which in part reflects optimistic funding assumptions. As a result, the Coast Guard has been shaping its asset acquisitions in reactive mode through the annual budget process. These short-term budget decisions may not lead to good long-term investments. A long-term fleet modernization plan that is affordable would help the Coast Guard to ensure that they end up with the fleet that they need to optimize performance going forward. My second point, based on a new GAO report completed at the request of this subcommittee and being released to the public today, is about improvements that the Coast Guard is making to its strategic deployment of assets. The Coast Guard has taken several steps to improve its asset deployment, including collecting better data on asset hours used by mission, tracking how increased strategic commitments are affecting the hours available to field unit commanders, and incorporating more realistic information about asset capacities into strategic planning documents. On this last point, we found that in FY15, Coast Guard units used only 3/4 of the asset resource hours that were allocated by headquarters through the strategic planning process. This is not a failure of Coast Guard personnel to make full use of their assets. Rather, the shortfall reflects an unrealistic statement of asset capacities based on manufacturer maximums that are not adjusted for asset age or condition. Incorporating more realistic information from the field units will allow the Coast Guard headquarters to have greater strategic influence on how asset hours are used. In conclusion, the Coast Guard is taking positive steps to improve the accuracy of its asset allocation process. This will help ensure that its limited assets are used as effectively as possible. Yet more work remains for the Coast Guard to identify the costs, capabilities, and quantities of the assets it needs for its modern fleet mix, as well as the trade-offs necessary given fiscal constraints. Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, this concludes my statement. I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Ms. Grover. Thank you both. We'll start taking questions now. I recognize myself. I guess the first thing is let's just touch on what you just talked about. It's not that the Coast Guard, it's not that they put the bar where it's supposed to be, then they can't reach the bar. The bar needs to be lower, meaning the bar needs to be lower in terms of what their assets can actually do, and that would make them actually look like they're doing their job better and allocating resources correctly.
In terms of the asset allocation process, that's right. They're using assumptions about asset capabilities that aren't realistic with what the assets can actually do.
So, Admiral, why would you set the bar unrealistically high and say every year we can't meet the bar?
Well, it's a complicated issue.
And we talked about this, by the way, when I first got this job at some point 3 or 4 years ago. I said, you guys aren't, by your own admission, you're not reaching your full capacity. And it was, but you are really. You are reaching your full capacity. It's just that the bar is set too high in whatever formula you use to say what your capacity should be.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated issue, Chairman. It has to do with accounting. So when we do our budget models and we figure out how many spare parts and our dry dock schedules and things like that, they're based on a baseline usage for that particular asset. And some assets like our rotary wing fleet, we operate within just a few percentages of what we allocate, and there are reasons for that. The vast majority of the operating hours that we have are down at our small boat stations. And there are very good reasons why our small boat stations don't operate at 100% capacity. Part of it is our small boat stations need surge capacity for things like hurricanes. So they're not supposed to exceed their When they start exceeding their hours, then they're burning the candle at both ends, and they're taxing the logistics systems, they're taxing the platforms, they're ending the service life of those platforms because they're operating above platform maximums. But they've got to plan all the way to the end of the fiscal year. I know you mentioned about surging 150 assets down to Hurricane Katrina. If you don't have that capacity in the system to surge, then you're going to exceed your
Ms. Grover's saying that you are operating at just about full capacity. It's simply not reflected in where you have the bar, meaning that gap doesn't really exist.
Well, if I lowered the bar artificially, I'd still have to take into account the maintenance schedules and budgeting and crew training and crew manning that come with that particular asset hour. And then what the guys at Small Boat Station will do, they'll take another cut even below that, so they make sure they have enough surge capacity to come along at the end of the fiscal year. And regrettably, the end of the fiscal year is July, August, and September, which is the height of hurricane season. And you've got to have some surge capacity. You can't budget every single hour up to the maximum allotted, or you're not going to have any surge capacity left, or you're going to exceed the operating hours on the platforms. And that has its own baggage when you go beyond the operating hours. I'll give you another example. For Great Lakes ice breaking, you can't predict what type of an ice year you're going to get up on the Great Lakes. A couple years ago, we had so much ice up there, we had to rely on the Canadians and others to help us out, or we would have been in a real world of hurt. But last year, we had hardly any ice at all. So how do you assign the operating hours for those platforms with any degree of certainty? And that's just one example. That goes across the entire enterprise. So it's an accounting measure in some perspective, and I could lower the bar. The problem is it's going to end up lowering the bar again. So I would prefer to stay with the maximum operating hours. That allows us to budget so that we can determine the service life for these platforms and allow our operational commanders to manage that surge gap. But I do agree with, and we did provide back to GAO's recommendation, that we would include better field input in trying to come up with realistic measures on this. And we agreed to do that, and I think we can close the gap to a certain degree, but I don't want to give you the illusion that we're going to budget down to the last hour here. It's just not possible, and not actually even desirable, Chairman, to do that.
Okay, so let's talk ice breaking then, since you brought it up, Admiral. The Senate just appropriated, or is going to appropriate $1 billion for an icebreaker. I mean, do we all know that now? It hasn't been passed yet, but they're going to do it. That's a pretty big leap. That's great that they're going to do it. So here's my question. We're going to give you're now going to have the authority to buy lead materials. You're going to have the authority to do block buys, multi-year procurement. You'll have the ability to buy 2 or 3 icebreakers if you wanted to at one time. So let's say that they do $1 billion. Ron O'Rourke was sitting here and testified that if you build 2, you can save $100 million. We're going to need more than one. Would the Coast, would you agree with that? We're going to need more than one icebreaker in the next 25 years? And this is all considering the fact that it's going to take 10 years to get this done, probably.
Well, first of all, when we talk about ice breaking, I talked about domestic ice breaking, which is in the Great Lakes rivers and things like that. That's its own world. So we're talking about polar ice breaking, yes. And we're talking specifically about heavy polar ice breaking.
Medium to heavy, right.
Well, we need to talk about that, sir, because there's different capabilities and different things that come along with medium and heavies. The Senate mark is for a heavy icebreaker. The President's budget request is for a heavy icebreaker. Yes, sir. And the President, in his statement at the Glacier Conference, said, we will begin construction activities on a heavy polar icebreaker, begin construction activities in 2020, and plan for additional icebreakers. Heavy icebreakers. Our commandants also testified that we need self-rescue capability for our heavy icebreaker, and that includes the existing Polar Star that we have out there now. So that means at least 2. The high latitude study says 3 heavy polar icebreakers is what the Coast Guard's requirement is. So that's kind of where we're talking about for heavy icebreakers.
Okay, so my question was, though, is the Coast Guard going to need more than one heavy icebreaker going forward in the next 25 years?
Yes.
Okay, then why don't we work with the Senate right now to work on saving $100 million and trying to build 2, or at least getting the lead materials and the designs for 2 instead of 1. I would guess once you design 1, you're going to find flaws in that, kind of like the NSC and some other ships that we've built. You're going to find flaws in the first one. It's going to cost money to fix those flaws in the first one, but that will set you up for success on your second one and follow-on ships, right?
Yes, sir, and I have staff looking at potential block buys of vessels of that. They're actively looking at that. Right now, the President's budget request is $150 million for the construction of a heavy polar icebreaker. And I support that request. We need that request, and we need that on the schedule that it is. I understand the Senate also included in the Navy shipbuilding budget $1 billion for a heavy polar icebreaker. Obviously, that's beyond the President's budget request, but I think it is a signal of, at least on the Senate side, of interest in constructing a heavy polar icebreaker. And that, my understanding of that language, that is a single vessel.
Okay. What would be the delivery time if everything was on schedule? What would be the delivery time for a heavy icebreaker?
So if the Congress were to approve the President's budget request for $150 million, I think it's $147 million, but I'll just use $150 million request, that is designed, sir, that figure is designed to meet the President's statement that he made at the Glacier Conference. So that would begin construction activities in 2020, and the estimated completion time to get that vessel online would be 2024 to 2025 is the best estimate that I have, having talked with my shipbuilding experts and also having sort of traveled around the world to a certain degree, talking with icebreaker experts as well as domestic shipyard people. 2024 to 2025 is my best estimate for getting that ship online.
Okay, so let's just, for argument's sake, for this hearing, so let's say it's 2026. So let's say it's 10 years out from now. What is your plan to address the capability gap in the next 10 years?
Well, and once again, we're talking about heavy polar icebreaking. This goes to a discussion Ranking Member Garamendi and I just recently had right here before the hearing. Right now, we have the Polar Star operating. It's got about another 5 to 7 years left of projected life unless we want to take another recapitalization, like a rolling recapitalization of that vessel, and we have not made a decision to do that. We just had Polar Sea, which is inoperable currently, out of the water at Vigor Shipyard, and an assessment is due to the committee on July the 24th, as promised by the Commandant, a material assessment of that particular vessel, and we are on schedule to deliver that to you. But all those decisions on a rolling recapitalization for Polar Star or what we want to do with Polar Sea need to be judged in context. And I have underway an alternatives analysis that will take a look at how we want to bridge out to that new icebreaker. And that's what I'd like to do, is bridge out to that new construction icebreaker that I request the Congress's support in assistance in the President's budget request.
So how do you plan to fill the capability gap over the next 10 years? So let's say that oil goes up to 120 bucks a barrel tomorrow, and then you get Shell and everybody else goes to the Arctic. They start trying to find oil there. It becomes very busy. What do you do? How do you fill the capability gap over the next 10 years?
Well, that's a broader question set, sir. And when you're talking about working in the type of work that Shell does, you're not necessarily talking about heavy icebreaking capability. Heavy icebreaking capability is a sort of sui generis. It's a world of its own. It provides you with 7 by 24 by 365 access to ice-covered regions. That's what heavy icebreaking capability does for you. Lesser types of vessels may be useful in seasonal areas or in less demanding ice environments than currently exist in Antarctica, or certain types of conditions that they get up in the Arctic with ridging and during certain parts of the year. We also have the vessel Healy, which is a medium icebreaker that is available. We're going to have to take a look on, and we already have a group underway on survey and design work for a midlife program or a service life extension program for the Healy. That vessel is usable for that type of work that Shell does, but it's not usable in the heavy icebreaking environments. So, for example, we took the Healy down in the early 2000s with the Polar Sea and Polar Star. I can't remember which one it was actually with. We took it down to Antarctica and see whether it could operate down there during the summer in Antarctica, and it got stuck in the ice. And we were lucky we had Polar Sea or Polar Star to go in there and break that thing out. So there are ice environments that are not
Conducive.
You can't use medium ice-breaking capability there. It ends up getting stuck, like the Shuilong. If you remember, the Chinese medium icebreaker got stuck, and the Akademik Tsiolkovsky got stuck. We cannot afford to get ships stuck. Right now where we are is we have the Polar Star operating the nation's only heavy ice-breaking capability, and there is no backup
I
for it.
pass this on to Mr. Garamendi. How do you plan on on filling the capability gap until you get a heavy icebreaker, which is 10 years at the least, based on the best projections of Congress and everybody working together? You still haven't answered that one.
Well, right, the alternatives analysis will provide the answer to that, and it's probably going to be either a rolling recapitalization of the Polar Star or to try to let Polar Star taper off and then try to bring Polar Sea back on and bridge out to the new icebreaker. I do not know which one at this point, which path we would want to take. I'm not aware of any other, we've looked out there for vessels to lease for heavy icebreaking capability. There's nothing out there on planet Earth that you can lease in the heavy icebreaking area. So that's kind of where we are, sir.
Was it the Finns that just came into my office? Can't remember whether we had the Norwegians or the Finns. I mean, you've obviously looked at that, right?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I traveled to Sweden and Finland and talked to them, and they do not have heavy icebreaking capability that will meet the needs as in the Fed BizOps. As a matter of fact, when I'm talking Fed BizOps, there's a technical package that the Coast Guard put out for our heavy icebreaker, kind of lays out our basic requirements, including the long pole in the tent, which is the icebreaking requirement, which is 6-foot minimum at 3 knots, desirable 8-foot minimum at 3 knots, and then 21 feet backing and ramming. When I talked to the shipbuilders over there, they said there is not a vessel like that that currently exists that will meet those requirements in the Fed BizOps technical package. So you'd have to build a vessel like that, and that's the type of vessel that we're looking for.
So the Finns, I mean, they have to break themselves out of their own sea every year, but that's not the same type of ice that's in the Arctic?
Well, it's not as thick. Medium icebreaking capability works in places like the Gulf of Bothnia because the ice is only, I forget the thing down there, but when you go down to Antarctica, for example, like first-year sea ice is 6 to 8 feet thick. Multiple-year sea ice is many times that. That's why the Healy got stuck down there.
So let's get to, so the options that you're telling us, you either take the Polar Star and as it either tapers off, you recapitalize the Polar Sea and make it work again, or you recapitalize the Polar Star and keep it going so it doesn't taper off as its end of life. But those are your two options. So, you're also saying that zero capability is better than medium or heavy capability, because you have medium heavy icebreakers out there that are available for lease, but you want heavy only, and you're saying that you'd rather have zero capability than 80% capability.
Sir, I think you're I don't
okay,
think that's a fair characterization. And that's why it's very important here on the medium.
You actually spent 2 or 3 minutes saying how you don't want medium icebreakers at all.
Sir,
they don't do very well. They get stuck. You gave the Chinese example. But so the question is then, to fill the capability gap over the next 10 years or 20 years or however long it is, your only answer is the Polar Star or the Polar Sea. Leasing a vessel there's no vessel that exists in the world that could be leased by the Coast Guard to fulfill 75% of what you need it to right now. Is that what you're saying? And you would rather not have those?
Sir, what I said was my options for heavy icebreaking capability, which is the only insured global access to ice-covered regions, regardless of seasonality and otherwise. The only things on the table that I'm dealing with right now are Polar Star, Polar Sea, and a new icebreaker that we need to begin construction activities on. If you want to have a broader discussion about other icebreaking functions, then we can talk about sir, but that's a different area because that is not global insured 7x24 by 365 access to ice-covered regions.
It's not a 100% solution.
Is one of our response. It's not a 100% solution, and in certain scenarios, like down in Antarctica, it's not only not a solution, it can potentially get you in a real hot water.
All right,
so that's a broader discussion because that's a different mission set. That's why I use those words, heavy polar icebreaking, because it is a world on its own, and we need to talk about that because that is a national capability, that is a national sovereignty capability, and national defense function to provide global insured access to ice-covered regions, 7x24 by 365, and that only gets done by heavy icebreaking capability.
Okay, so here's my last question. Could you explain to everybody why it's important to break ice? And then tell me this, if we're looking for 724, 365, what are we operating at now?
So ice breaking in and of itself, there are times that you really do need to break ice for flood control reasons or to escort
So
vessels
tell
in
us
and
this,
out.
so let's narrow this down. Why is it a national security strategic priority to break ice? On the national security side, I don't care about some ship getting stuck who's doing science stuff. Why is it a national security priority?
Sir, if you cannot provide presence to an area, you cannot assert national sovereignty.
Then what are we doing right now?
The nation's only operating heavy ice-breaking capability is the Polar Star.
And it operates 7/24
That ship is currently operational. It requires a significant amount of maintenance just to keep the thing running. It has no self-rescue capability unless we happen to call in some other country that happens to have a heavy...
Here's what I'm trying to get to. So what is our capability now then? Right now?
The Polar Star, sir.
Okay, and is it 7/24/365?
It has the capability, but it has such a maintenance schedule that it gets pulled out of the water regularly, and you're going to have to button the ship back up in order to get anywhere.
So how many
That's the
days-
problem with having only one, sir.
So we don't have, so what you're saying is right now, how would you measure the capability gap that we have right now, that exists right now today?
Well, we have one heavy polar icebreaker.
That
ship
operates
does,
how many days out of the year?
Well, that ship has the capability of accessing anywhere in the ice-covered region, 7/24/365. It has that capability, except for very shallow areas where you may have draft
I understand the
restrictions and stuff.
capability of it. How often does it do that, or how often can it?
Well, this is what the maintenance schedule. Last year, that ship's crew spent 305 days away from their families, either down in Antarctica or at the shipyards, which was away from their home port, getting that ship repaired. So you can operate...
Beyond getting it fixed, what is our capability right now in heavy ice? What is capability right now today? In fact, is it operational right now?
The Polar Star is an operational vessel, yes, sir.
Okay, and what is our capability like this year, for instance?
Well, we typically have that ship programmed to operate 185 days away from home port. But it's got such a significant maintenance load. It basically goes from the shipyard, and then it does its work down in Antarctica, then it goes back to the shipyard. And it gets refurbished, and we send it back down to Antarctica again.
So this is it, then. I've taken way too long. If it's so important that the president's asked for this, that the OMB has put it in, we don't have the capability right now, so how can it be that big of a priority? If you don't have the ability to do what we need to do now to match what the president's requesting, is it really that big of a priority? Do we really need two icebreakers, two heavy icebreakers?
Absolutely, sir, and we've had that.
But if it's so important, why don't we have them now?
That's a very sad and long tale, sir, as to why it has taken so long to recapitalize this category of vessels. I don't know how much time you want to take on that, but I used to be a commander, and I used to work...
Zero. I'm hearing her talking to my ear. I'm going to yield to the ranking member here.
I worked on this issue 15
We're going to beat
years
this horse
ago
more.
myself, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure we broke through the ice yet, but we know that we do have a hearing coming up on the 12th, and I think Admiral Michel has a pretty good idea of the kind of questions that's going to be coming at him on the 12th of July. And it'll be a very, very important meeting. I did note in your testimony, you said that we really need 3 heavy icebreakers to do the job of that the chairman was trying to get to. That's the Arctic and the Antarctic in the most extreme environment. So the question for the 12th will be, how do we get those 3 icebreakers over what period of time? What is the schedule for them? And also the role of the Polar Star and the Polar Sea in the interim. So we'll go at that in detail, and between now and the 12th, I'm sure that we'll have some additional questions to ask. A 10th national security cutter is in the works, at least the legislative works. That is 2 beyond the original call of 8. When the 9th is added, which is not so far off, and then perhaps a 10th, that changes your force structure, your person power, and your budgeting. should we go there at all? Should we simply say that 9 is quite enough? The 10th is a ship too far, too much, and that we should spend the time and energy and money on the offshore patrol cutter? Admiral Michel?
Well, sir, NSC 9 and if there is an NSC 10, none of those are in the president's budget request. Those are beyond the program of record. I've testified on that before. Obviously, you know, if the Congress provides us with national security cutters, we'll do our best to put them to good use. They're a great ship. They're delivering incredible results out there, but those are beyond the program of record. And right now, my number one recapitalization priority, despite my urgency on the heavy icebreakers, which is, you know, another one of the burning fires I have to deal with, is the offshore patrol cutter. And that is our number one recapitalization priority. And we need assistance from the Congress on the $100 million in long lead time materials in FY17 for the offshore patrol cutter. That's where my focus is right now. Again, if Congress gives us the national security cutters, we will try to make them work. They are beyond our program of record. They are much more expensive to operate than the offshore patrol cutter is going to be.
Admiral, we're going to have to be much more specific. I know you will do what Congress tells you to do if you have the money to do it. But we're going to have to make some decisions here. Do we do a 10th national NSC or do we not? If we do, then obviously there's the capital cost of the ship, and then there's the ongoing operational cost that have to come out of some other program. The other programs, maybe the OPC, maybe we're going to delay the acquisition of the second or third heavy icebreaker. Or maybe we're not going to be able to use UAVs or whatever. So we need your help, very specifically, in the mission statement that came out in January of this year will help advise us on this. But somebody wants a 10th national security cutter. Do we do it or not? That's going to be a decision we're going to have to make in the next couple of months. If we make that decision, then something else isn't going to happen. What isn't going to happen? Perhaps it is the icebreaker. I want to really hone in on that because it's something we must deal with here within our two houses. The other questions really go to, we'll come back to the icebreaker on the 12th, I'm sure. UAVs, talked about forever but not yet in place. What do we need? Is it important? Is it a critical mission asset that the Coast Guard needs? If so, how do we get it? What's the cost? Where does it fit into the mission statement? UAVs.
So another broad category of things. So on the small UAV front, I think you know we've already deployed Scan Eagle on a number of platforms. We're going to have Scan Eagle or the small UAS deployed on the NSC permanently here for the first time. So in that small category, I think we're okay. We're also in a partnership with CBP on their Predator. It's essentially Predator B. They call it Guardian. As a matter of fact, it's flying down in the transit zone today, or it's at least deployed down in the transit zone today. So we work with them on that mission set. The broader piece on the UAS, that's actually one of the pieces here from the 2005 MINS that Jenny identified that we're going to have to take a round turn on what our view is on these larger UASs, land-based UASs or ship-based. We also have worked closely with the Navy on their Fire Scout, which isn't really the right sort of platform for us, but I don't know what the right answer to that is. I think both the land-based and the ship-based UASs or UAVs, the larger systems, are something I'm intensely interested in. When I was JADF South Director, we would use platforms like this to provide wide area surveillance capability, and that makes your assets a lot more effective, and the Coast Guard could definitely benefit from that. So we have an eye on working on all those programs. We've got some unique connections with DoD and also with DHS and CBP. So I think we've got the connections. We're going to have to make some decisions. Right now, our organizational recapitalization priorities are as laid out in the FY17 budget and as in the FY17 to 21 SIP that I know you have a copy of. Those are our organizational priorities, and right now those larger UASs are not built in there. I can tell you as Vice Commandant of the Coast Guard, same thing when I was a Deputy Commandant for Operations, I'm intensely interested in that area because the technology gets better and better, the dwell times get better and better, the sensors get better and smaller, and the back-end processing pieces get better and better, and those can make our assets so much more effective. When I was JADF South Director, those were great things, and I loved having them down there. And I'd like to see the Coast Guard get into that game, but, you know, there's only so much money out there, and our organizational priorities are currently as set forth in the President's budget and in our SIP that we provided to you.
I appreciate your intense interest in this. Our task is to make choices. And we have one choice that's coming down on us right now, a 10th national security cutter, which is over $500 million, not including the operational cost. And so the question for the Coast Guard, and we need an answer here. Do we do that, or do we spend that money on UAVs, UASs, and the like? That's the question. What is your answer?
Well, sir, I mean, that's a very easy question from the Coast Guard. Our organizational recapitalization priorities are as set forth in the President's FY17 budget request and in the SIP that we provided to you. If they're not included in there, it doesn't mean they're not things of value, but our organizational priorities are as we provided them to you, and that's our best judgment as operators and as stewards
does that include a
of the
10th
enterprise.
national security cutter? Does that include a 10th national security cutter?
No, sir, that is not currently in the SIP or in the President's budget request.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the ranking member. Mr. Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Admiral, for your service and the nearly 90,000 men and women that helped protect our country. Back in March, I submitted questions for the record to the Coast Guard regarding the icebreakers on the Great Lakes. And the first question inquired about the Coast Guard's memorandum of understanding with the Canadian Coast Guard to provide icebreaking vessels. And the second inquiry was about the Coast Guard setting performance targets for keeping the high priority waterways open on the Great Lakes and the eastern seaboard during ice season. 95% of the time, that's I think the Coast Guard's goal. However, you only collected the data whether you met the target in fiscal year 14, at which time the Coast Guard fell short of its goal by 10%, and I realized that was the bad ice year, I believe. We have not received an answer on FY 15 or 16, which I think wasn't much ice last year, so that probably was not too much of an issue. But back on the memorandum of understanding, it's my knowledge that Canada has gone from 7 to 2 vessels for icebreaking on the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway. So I'm concerned about, what's in that memorandum of understanding, because the peak demand for the Upper Great Lakes opening up for the season would be probably close to the same time as open up the Seaway. And, what's our situation with that memorandum of understanding of what we're going to do to ensure that the Canadian icebreaker will be at the Sioux Locks, for example, when it's probably at the same time they need to be, in the eastern part of the Great Lakes and the Seaway. And so I don't know, usually the Coast Guard's been pretty good at getting back to answering these questions, but I submitted these questions for the record back in March and we haven't heard back. And so hopefully you can provide them now or provide them in the future in a timely manner.
Well, sir, I apologize in advance that you have not received that information. All that information should be available to you on both our agreements with Canada as well as our performance metrics on the ice, which you rightfully noted. I mean, that's an example of one of those problem sets that's very difficult to predict. I mean, some years you may end up with a large amount of ice, like I said, in 14, and we needed the Canadians' help to do all that stuff, whereas last year we hardly had any ice at all, so it's difficult to predict. So you've got my commitment to provide you with all that information. We have that information on the performance data, and we'll definitely get you the information on our workings with Canada, which, like I said, are essential. And we think we add a lot of value to the Canadians, too, so we help them out. It's a quid pro quo and really a good arrangement that we have with our neighbors to the north.
We really only have, well, on the Great Lakes, is the Mackinac. Is that unavailable right now, or this last season? What's its status with that?
No, sir. Mackinac is up and running. I think it's actually in the dockside maintenance period. As a matter of fact, I had the commanding officer of the Mackinac was in my office yesterday. He wasn't there to talk about Mackinac. He was there to get some career counseling from the Vice Commandant of the Coast Guard. But I talked to him about his vessel, and he's really happy with it. That's a really interesting vessel, and I bring that one to your attention. If you haven't seen that, this is a modern icebreaking vessel. It's got steerable azipods. It's not a blunt instrument like the old icebreakers that we used to have. And we also have the 225-foot WLBs, which do ice breaking up there, and the 140-foot harbor tugs, essentially ice breaking tugs, which work in that area. And the good thing about having a down ice season like this, we were able to get a number of those vessels down to the Coast Guard Yard, and they got refurbished. So we're actually in pretty good shape with our.
Let's say next year next winter season we have a big ice season like we did in 14. I don't know how many icebreakers Canada had, but is that correct that they've gone from 7 down to 2?
Sir, I'm going to have to get back to you on the status of their fleet. They're in a recapitalization effort as well, but I'll get you that information.
I'd be concerned if they had, say they had 5 ships in operation in 14 and now they're down to 2 and I guess I'd be concerned since we have the memorandum of understanding and try to work together. Obviously, Canada's a great ally, but we want to make sure that that's going to be an issue because if the Great Lakes doesn't get opened up in a timely fashion, it's interesting. We did, Mr. Chairman, we did the WERDA 14. We put the Great Lakes as a unit for the Army Corps of Engineers, and what was interesting, we learned that when you put all the Great Lakes ports together, it's 25% of the economic activity of all the ports. And my good friend from California, both of them from California, I know how big the ports are out there on the coast, but 25% when you add, and what's interesting, what's going on in the Great Lakes, that's unique compared to the ports on the west, east, and Gulf Coast is there's a lot of stuff moving in between the ports. So if one port the Soo locks aren't opened up, what that does down in the Lake Erie and Ontario regions is it's a severe impact because we're moving so much stuff. We're interdependent within the Great Lakes, and it's obviously moving stuff through the seaway. But we have a huge interdependency, so it's important not only to get the seaway open, which I think Canada is probably maybe the more principal in that, but also to make sure we have the Soo locks and access up to Lake Superior. So thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Ms. Hahn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Garamendi, for having this hearing. Admiral Michelle, I'm glad my colleague, Representative Gibbs, brought up the ports. I represent the Port of Los Angeles, and Long Beach is right next door. We're America's ports. Over 40% of all the trade that comes through this country comes through our ports. And since 9/11, I have been particularly concerned about the threat of our national security as it relates to our ports. While we have no ice in Los Angeles or Long Beach, I think the greater threat really revolves around our ports. If there was ever something to happen at our ports, it would not only cripple the regional economy, the national economy, it would cripple the global economy. Since fiscal year FY 2001, the Coast Guard's largest percentage of funding for missions has been dedicated to ports, waterways, and coastal security. However, I've been troubled to see in recent years the percent share of funding for these vital missions has decreased. I would like for you to share with me, and I know it's going to be about resources and it's going to be about priorities, but I would like to hear from you, Admiral, why the share of funding to our ports has decreased in recent years.
Well, I think you're talking about Coast Guard resource hours from September 11th. So if I can just kind of take you back to September 11th. Right after September 11th, the Coast Guard was on an all-hands-on-deck evolution, and we threw whatever we could at ports, waterways, and coastal security because that was deemed to be the threat at the time. And there were a lot of Coast Guard boats that were operating out there, a lot of hours, these operating hours that were being burned up by boats doing things. Today, we're in a much actually better position because of intelligence-driven operations, because of programs like Protect, which is a randomization algorithm that we use that makes our assets actually more effective in deterrence. We're able to, with less boat hours, actually provide more protection. Just like in the Port of LALB, think about the additional cameras and sensor networks and the information sharing and the command centers that have been put in place to actually inform operations out there rather than just throwing boats out there just to have kind of a cop on the beat. We're so much better than we were back in September 11th, and we can do things, Congressman Hahn, with less brute force and achieve higher degrees of performance, which, you know, we were talking about operating hours. I mean, operating hours are very interesting and they're important for spare parts and dry dock and stuff like that, but you want to get at the organizational performance. And an op hour back in September 11th was way less valuable than a boat op hour today, which is all informed by intelligence-driven operations, much more capable small boats than we have, much better communications gear, better working relationship with the local authorities. I mean, it's just all there. We're much better than we were back in those days.
So you will say that the threat still exists. I mean, after 9/11, I know our ports were sometimes in the top 10 of potential targets. So the threat still exists. Is that what you're saying? But you think you're doing it smarter?
We're doing it smarter, and we understand the threats much better. So back.
And share with me how you do leverage, since the resources seem, in my opinion, to be less. You may be working smarter and with algorithms, but that doesn't make me feel any better. But share with me how you're leveraging your limited resources with the Port Police, the LA County Sheriff's Department, FBI, some of the counterterrorism groups that are situated right there in the harbor.
Sure. Well, there's a whole piece there, and we have an Area Maritime Security Committee,
Right.
which stood up prior to or after September 11th, at least in its fullest form, and it brings together all those port partners. You know, they're all brought together, and they deal even with things as sophisticated as cyber is on the AMSC agenda. And the Coast Guard chairs that. The Coast Guard is by statute. The captain of the port is the designated Federal Maritime Security Coordinator, and he or she has that role. And they can bring all those people together, and they can pool all those different assets, and they can set together interoperable communications. They can set together combined operations. They do exercises. They build out all that stuff. So again, it's a much more sophisticated enterprise. And I don't want to leave you that, you know, the port of LALB is just protected in LALB. You also have to understand that we've got mechanisms overseas that work on those
Right.
cargoes and those
Right.
foreign nationals and foreign ships before they even show up in the port of LALB.
Correct, and I understand that, and I know the layered approach to security. But let me just, if I may, just take a couple, a little bit longer. You know, the new.
Please take as long as you like.
Thank you. That was so good, because if you'd have said anything different, I would have been really. You know, the CMA CGM Benjamin Franklin, the mega ship. Called both at Long Beach and Los Angeles. Megaships can hold up to 22,000 containers. You know, that's a lot of containers coming into our ports at one time, much greater than, you know, we're used to. Explain to me how, you know, the Coast Guard is ready for that, is prepared for that. You know, hopefully it's more than just algorithms that you're using to consider that certain cargo could be at risk.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a challenging question. It deals with not only the volume on a particular vessel, but I mean, you've just got more containers moving all the time, and that becomes a harder and harder risk. Coast Guard works with CBP primarily, but also international partners, and we try to vet as many of those shippers. I mean, the good part about 22,000 containers on a ship is you only deal with one ship. So, you know, you look at that crew, you look at that ship, instead of multiple ships where you got to look at multiple crews. But you got more containers, and all those containers, ideally you don't want those ships to even show up in the United States before they've undergone at least some screening. So you deal with things like CSI, the Container Security Initiative, or the Customs Transnational Partnership Against Terrorism, CTPAT, whatever, trusted shipper programs, which help a lot. So a lot of that box traffic that comes into LALB comes from people like Walmart and things like that, and they have a vested interest in making sure that they provide global security chains, and that can help things move through the system quicker. So there are screening programs that start all the way overseas with 24-hour lading rules from the Customs Service, and electronic manifesting that allows you to look at all these different electronic manifests and try to screen those containers before they even show up. But it's a challenge, Congresswoman, that increasing global trade And things like Panama Canal expansion are going to increase all these challenges because we love global trade and it brings all these great things from the outside, but for an agency like the Coast Guard, it taxes our system because it's just more volume that you have to be able to dig through. But we try to look at all that stuff.
And I appreciate,
vessels, people, and
I
cargo.
appreciate, and I have had a long relationship with the men and women of the Coast Guard, and the Long Beach, LA sector is just such a great place with wonderful men and women who, our commanding officer out there, Captain of the Port, Captain Williams, has been amazing in working with us. But I will tell you, I'm going to end by saying I still think our ports are a vulnerable entryway into this country. And I don't want for any second to feel like we've let our guard down because I think that's what they're waiting for. And they know one incident of a mass explosion at that port complex could create havoc in this country and globally. So, pay more attention to the ports and less attention to ICE.
You've got my full attention, Congresswoman.
Thank the gentlelady. Okay, let's go on a little bit more icebreaker because I guess I get to ask that if I want to because I'm the chairman. So here's my question. We were looking back over time. After World War II, in the 40s, we started making icebreakers. We didn't build a heavy icebreaker until 77 or so. That was the Polar S word, Sea or Star, yeah. So we went through the majority of the Cold War. We went through 30, 40 years without a heavy icebreaker, but multiple medium icebreakers. So my question is, what were they doing with those non-heavies during the Cold War when we had to be in the Arctic? And I'm guessing there's a couple of reasons that we wanted to be in the Arctic. Russia was the main one. How do we do that without a heavy? How do we go for 40 years of Cold War with no heavy icebreakers?
Well, sir, it's an interesting question when you go all the way back in there, and it depends on how you classify things. Certainly, Polar Sea and Polar Star by today's are heavy icebreakers. As a matter of fact, they're the most powerful non-nuclear icebreakers that exist. They're 75,000 shaft horsepower. They can operate independently. You like to have self-rescue capability. You can operate independently. What has happened is a number of these icebreakers, we'll only go back to World War II. So a number of these icebreakers were built in World War II. The Glacier's an example of that, the Island class, Burton Island, and the different ones. Part of how they got around it was these were medium icebreakers. Depends on Glacier, depends on how you classify it, but these were medium icebreakers, but you had a bunch of them. When the Commandant of the Coast Guard came in, we had 7 polar icebreakers when the Commandant came in. When I came in, we had 5. We had Polar Sea, Polar Star, Glacier, and 2 wind class icebreakers. And when you can send mediums down there, multiple of them, it buys down some of your risks for getting in a bad situation.
Well, but let's keep this simple because I don't want to go on about icebreakers forever again. But I'm just curious. We didn't have a heavy until the late 70s. So what did we do in the Arctic? If you had a sub or something that needed to get out of the ice, how would we have done that without a heavy at all? Because we didn't have a heavy at all.
Well, sir, it depends on how you classify those vessels. Glacier.
Okay, but, Admiral, keep this simple for me. I'm not trying to use special words to try to, I'm just asking you, you didn't have a heavy. Okay, so how do you classify, but you said you have to have a heavy, because I said medium heavy, and you said no. It's got to be a heavy. It's got to be 365, 24/7, heavy icebreaker, which we don't have at all now. Or we do, that can work half the year or when it has to or when it's not getting worked on. You don't have the capability now. You didn't have the capability for 40 years post-World War II. So what is different now to where multiple mediums or medium heavies can't take the place of a heavy for the next 10 years to fill that capability gap? I'm not understanding now. Now I'm totally perplexed
sir, I mean,
because we didn't have a heavy until 77.
Clearly, we did not have a vessel as capable as Polar Sea or Polar Star.
But you're going for the 100% solution. I'm asking, how did you not have a 100% solution but still get the job done for 40 years? That's all I'm asking. How did the Navy do that? The Coast Guard.
Sir, I don't know.
Well,
I'd have to
I'm gonna
provide you
answer it for you.
how they operated.
The answer is because they didn't have a heavy and they still got the job done. They were able to make do with an 80% solution, which you're telling me is impossible and not what the Coast Guard wants. And you're willing to wait till, what, 2026, 2030, for multiple heavies to come online in our dreamland when you and I are no longer here, and it's the next Congress 10, 20 years from now, and who knows what's going on. What you're offering me is kind of a non-solution solution, saying we got to have the 100%. We didn't have the 100% until, fairly recently. So, help me out here.
Sir, I'm just giving you my best advice, and my best advice is to invest in the capability that provides you with that
But how do you
assured
fill
global access.
that gap right now? Without leasing multiple mediums, non-heavies, whatever you want to call them.
Well, sir,
The
you've got-
non-super perfect one that you're talking
You've got
about.
the Polar Star and you've got the Polar Sea are essentially what's in my toolkit now for providing heavy
The
ice-breaking
Polar Star is
capability.
only kind of in your toolkit when it's working. Polar Sea. Right.
No, Polar Sea is broken.
Guys, Polar Sea is broken. Polar Star is kind of in your toolkit.
Sir, it's a declared operational vessel of the
understand, but
Coast
it's
Guard.
getting
It's got
fixed all the time.
baggage. It's got baggage because it's an old vessel, but it is an operational vessel of the Coast Guard.
Okay, but you understand my reasoning here, right? Does it make sense to you?
It makes sense to me, sir, but I don't know what the mission sets were in 1955 and 1960. I'm only dealing with the
I
Coast
would
Guard
guess
I
it had
have
to do
now.
with the Cold War and being in the Arctic. That's my guess. Wouldn't you assume that? Wouldn't you assume that it had to do with the Cold War and the Soviet Union and breaking out subs or doing something in the Arctic?
No, I would assume that, and my guess is that there was probably more presence up there and maybe more
But then how were they able to
self-rescue
do that
capability than we have
without
today.
a heavy icebreaker?
Sir, I don't know if this is going to be productive because I'm not sure what those mission sets were back in those days, and there was a lot more just capability for self-rescue and other things that don't exist today. It was a different world back then than it is today. All I can tell you is it's my best advice as a sailor and a guy who's actually been in Antarctica and been on Polar Stars. It broke out that ice road dealing with these huge chunks of ice. I mean, these things are the size of school buses trying to break its way through there. And the fact that we tried Healy down the Antarctic, and Healy's a pretty capable vessel. It's 30,000 shaft horsepower, and it got stuck. I don't want ships to get stuck. I want to buy capability that's going to be enduring and lasting. We only get this recapitalization opportunity once every, it's been a long, long time. And I want to make sure that what we buy is good because you may not see another one of these icebreakers for 40, 50 years in the Coast Guard budget. The last time the
Not
Coast
the way
Guard
we're
had
going
money
right
in
now.
its
We're gonna see
budget
zero.
for a heavy icebreaker was Polar Sea and Polar Star. Even the Healy was in the Navy's shipbuilding budget. So we got to make sure that, all I can tell you is this, my best advice, sir, that our best investment at this point for heavy icebreaking capability is to figure out what to do with Polar Sea and Polar Star to bridge out to the new icebreaker that's in the President's budget request. And I don't think that that's unreasonable. Do I wish this would have been solved earlier? Absolutely, I do. But it's not. And I'm the Vice Commandant of the Coast Guard. I got to deal with this problem now.
Well, tell you what, we're going to go back and look and see how we were able to exist as a nation that operated in the Arctic without having a heavy icebreaker. And then we'll come and inform the Coast Guard on how we do that, okay? So here's my second point here. I have a document, we asked CBP how many requests from the Coast Guard did they receive for UAS, okay? Those requests come back here to the CBP's Air and Marine Operations Joint Program Office, CBP headquarters in DC, blah, blah, blah. Here's the CBP's answer. CBP conducted a careful review and despite a well-established process by which all Department of Homeland Security components request UAS support could not locate any prior requests from the U.S. Coast Guard. It was dated April 25th. So according to the CBP, the Coast Guard's never requested UAS. I mean, this is theirs. I just quoted them. Can you just talk about that for a minute? That's kind of perplexing, right?
Well, sir, for a Coast Guard mission set, it actually doesn't surprise me that we would make a request to CBP. Most of those UAS hours that would be useful to us would be done through JADF South. And JADF South is the one who has lead responsibility. It's a DOD entity, as you know, that has lead responsibility for detection and monitoring of drug trafficking in the Western Hemisphere Transit Zone. They provide us with the network. It doesn't surprise me because CBP is providing it to JADF South. They're not providing it directly to the Coast Guard.
So if we were to ask them, okay, so we should rephrase our question, how many requests has JADF South requested from CBP for the Coast Guard to use UAS?
Sir, we're not the only users of the JADF South Network. Like I said, the CBP Guardian is, my understanding, is down and working for JADF right now and works for a whole range of different partners, including international partners who rely on those sensors that are carried by that UAS. So when I say intelligence-driven operations, then the JADF South AOR, the Coast Guard's a participant in that, but we're not the only part of that intelligence-driven enterprise.
But you are the main interdiction, especially now that the Navy's left and gone west. You are the main interdiction agency that operates there, correct?
For maritime interdiction, the Coast Guard typically gets the lion's share of the interdictions, but the entire intelligence networks that backs that up doesn't,
No, but-
actually, most of it doesn't belong to the Coast
But you're the operational agency that actually interdicts. I mean, you have the platforms, you have the cutters and the helicopters and the airplanes that interdict, right? You don't find it strange that not a single request was logged by the CBP from the Coast Guard? Once again, that is not strange to you in any way.
No, sir. No, sir. It is not. That when CBP goes down and works in that enterprise, they work for JADF South, which is a DoD entity, and they contribute their platforms along
Would
with the other
JADF South
platforms.
have a
Coast Guard wouldn't
Coast
make
Guard
that request directly.
So the Coast Guard wouldn't request the asset at all? It would be JADF South requesting it and telling the Coast Guard where to go with it? Or what to go look at, or what? Explain it to me.
JADF South has TACON of all the resources that are provided to JADF South, including Coast Guard cutters. And Coast Guard cutters have to actually chop back to the Coast Guard in order to do the law enforcement mission that they do down there. But the wide area surveillance and the intelligence network, it's not, that's not directly owned by the Coast Guard.
Do you
I don't know
think
any
it
other
would
way to
be-
describe that,
Do you
sir.
think it would be a benefit to the Coast Guard to own its own UAS? You obviously said that you were intensely interested.
I told you, sir, I'm intensely interested in that because I'd like to see the Coast Guard get an oar in the water and have its own organic capability for its own uses, as well as be able to contribute to these broader enterprises like JADF South. And I think the Coast Guard brings unique experience within DHS and unique connections with the Department of Defense and intelligence community to be able to actually build out our own organic
let me ask you
unmanned
this, sir.
aerial
If-
systems capability.
If your requirements are being met right now by JADF South and CBP, why would you need your own organic capability?
Once again, sir, I can envision, that's not the only thing that we would use these for. I could envision these being used for remote areas of our EEZ that are very difficult to monitor. And we probably wouldn't want to, request that of CBP to provide that capability. I don't know, but there are a bunch of other mission sets that the Coast Guard could use if we had capabilities like this. That's why I'm very interested.
But you wouldn't spend the money on a UAS platform or system to go look at the far reaches of our EEZ. I mean, you would use them for your main priority missions, I would guess, wouldn't you?
Sir, I take, I and the rest of our enterprise, we do risk calculations on a daily
What I'm
basis. I
saying
got
is
11
we're not going
missions.
to allocate money for you to get a UAS if the whole point of it is to just go look at the ocean in the corners of our EEZ to make sure that the corals are growing properly or something, right? I mean, that's not the point of getting the system. It'd be used on interdiction so you could raise your numbers of drugs and ships that you interdict coming up from South and Central America, right?
That would be a priority mission. There's actually infrastructure in place to do that, so you can actually get land-based system. But I don't want, sir, I'll give you an example. We get dozens upon dozens of illegal fishing vessel and drug incursions along our southwest border on both the Texas side and near your district. We get those panga boats that come zipping by, and we get a bunch of illegal fishermen over on the Texas side. Both of those mission sets could use some additional maritime domain awareness, which could be provided by long dwell sensors placed there by unmanned aerial systems. So there's a whole bunch of different mission sets that the Coast Guard could use these on. For example, our maritime boundary line up with Russia, we patrol that all the time to prevent Russian fishing vessel incursions. Perhaps you could use that unmanned aerial system in order to do that. And we're probably not going to request that from CBP because I got other fish I got to fry. But if we had our own organic capability that we could use to actually build out some expertise in our organization, we could use it across a whole bunch of different mission sets, of which drug interdiction down the Western Hemisphere Transit Zone, I assume, would be a priority mission, but it's not going to be the only one. I wouldn't want to build it just for that particular mission set. I would want to build it so hopefully it's a multi-mission platform and I can use it in all the different Coast Guard mission sets, even for counterterrorism. You can imagine different maritime counterterrorism scenarios where you might want
Absolutely.
to have something like that.
Let me tell you what your guys are saying down south. We have statements from multiple Coast Guardsmen about their request being denied by the CBP when they asked for the assets. And I'll be happy to share that with you later, off the record here. There have been Coast Guard requests for unmanned surveillance aircraft that have been denied by CBP. And I'll be happy to share those instances with you at some other time. John, do you have any more? Do you want to keep going?
Yes, sir.
I
I
yield.
look forward to seeing that. I'm not sure exactly what happens all the way down at the tactical level.
Okay. I yield to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction here. There's ongoing questions, and one of your tasks is the maintenance of navigation. And specifically, does your plan call for recapitalization of the tenders, the buoy tenders?
Yep.
And if so, what's it take? How serious is that problem? There are those who think that the buoy tenders are rusting out. Could you speak to that?
Well, sir, again, there's a couple different classes of vessels. So there's kind of the coastal buoy tenders, which are our 225s and 125s. Those actually have an in-service vessel sustainment program, and they're going, as a matter of fact, I think one up in the Coast Guard yard right now. They're taking care of some of they had an engine control system that had some problems. They're replacing that whole system. Those are actually in pretty good shape for our coastal buoy tenders. I think what you're alluding to is our inland
It is.
river tender fleet. A lot of that is really actually quite old. The good part about it is the environmentals there are usually pretty benign. They're in fresh water. They're not exposed to the dangers of the sea because they're in a river system, so they tend to last a little bit longer. We did put some new engines in those craft, but those do need recapitalization. They're not currently in our capital investment plan. How we include those, it's another area that needs to be recapitalized. Currently, it is not in our organizational priorities to do that, but it's on my radar for sure, because there are vessels in there that are 50 plus years old and need to be recapitalized.
Okay. I'd like you to have a little more detail about that in response to a written question we'll get you about the recapitalization of the inland tenders, buoy tenders. I want to spend more time on the UAVs, UASs, and the like. It seems to me that the technology, as you have said, is rapidly advancing. And if we're able to move the Coast Guard more quickly into the utilization of these multiple types of assets, some on the water, some in the air, the satellites, and particularly the coordination with the military, some of which is operating, for example, the new naval systems. I think it's called the Poseidon, the Trident. They'll be operating out there, for example, in the San Diego area, part of it being their testing. And perhaps that information would also be available to the Coast Guard, doing multiple tasks, some for the Coast Guard, some for the Navy. So I want to spend time with you on the future of this entire aspect, and also where the money is for them. I think that we hit some of this earlier with the NSC, 10th, $500 million. How many UAS or UAV assets could we purchase, the personnel to go with it, and so forth? I don't expect an answer right now, but just some general philosophy from you. I think we've heard some of it. I want to go into it in more detail. So if you could expand on that.
Well, I think
We've got the book,
Well,
we've got the mission needs statement, and we've got the president's budget.
Yes, sir. And the President's budget lay out our organizational recapitalization priorities. This is what I got to rack and stack. So I see great promise in unmanned aerial systems. Like I said, I was JADF South Director. I'm a buyer, but I got to put this in rack and stack against all my other priorities. And I've got sailors out there on ships that are going to be 55 years old, and it's not a river tender fleet that's on freshwater on a river somewhere. These are people who are out exposed in real perils of the sea, putting our sailors out in 55 and 60-year-old ships on a 210-foot class of cutters, which, by the way, got a big bust today down
I'm
operating
trying-
off.
Excuse me, Admiral, I'm going to try to stay within my allotted 5 minutes.
Yes, sir. It's just a
Here's
priority
what-
issue.
Here's what I need in order to make decisions. I see my task as basically choices. And it is not clear to me what the Coast Guard would like to have. There's this thing called need to and like to. I'm going to the need to. I believe that we have to move towards these unmanned vehicles, both marine as well as aerial, and the integration of them into your operation. Presently, it is not, there's a little bit of money in the budget, there's a little bit of thinking about it, but it seems to me that it is not adequately addressed. So for the Coast Guard, for you, what would be the ideal situation, the integration of these types of assets into the ongoing operations? I understand that you've got men and women out there in the ships are old, and there's questions of safety as well as viability. But how much additional money would be necessary to ramp up and then integrate into the Coast Guard operation these new types of assets? They're not really new, but new to the Coast Guard. I understand you're doing some of it today. What would it be? Is it another 100 million, 200 million, $500 million? What are we talking about here? So there's that question. There's one other, so I'm going to come back at you in future hearings to dwell upon that issue. I do have a question that was raised by Ms. Grover, and that has to do with the accounting, that it is not uniform within the service, that there are some who are keeping score, and there are others that are not, and therefore the ability of the Coast Guard management to understand the deployment of assets is not as good as it should be. Is that right, Ms. Grover?
We found that the Coast Guard data on how the assets are deployed by mission is not reliable.
Okay. So what are you doing about it, Admiral?
Oh, boy. Well, first of all, we're working with GAO, and we appreciate them bringing that to our attention. This is part of the baggage of being a multi-mission organization. So when you send any Coast Guard platform out there, almost all of them are multi-mission in nature. And how do you account for an hour spent on PWICs and search and rescue and maritime law enforcement, and it goes all the way down. I mean, and the people who are reporting here, this is not captains or something. These are, the coxswain of the boat who reports how many hours he or she spent doing something in a port. And we can certainly tighten it up. I think the call by GAO for additional input from the operational commanders will help us get the accounting issue. But it's a difficult thing for a multi-mission organization to just bin every single hour accurately. But we got the challenge, and we appreciate GAO's highlighting on that. And we'll continue working with them and see if we can close the gap here a little bit, because I think there's some money to be made here.
Yeah, I think you should also keep in mind what the chairman said at the outset in his opening statement. You can become very bureaucratic and waste a lot of time and energy. So there's got to be some way in which, but the basic point here is the allocation of your resources. If you've got a ship out there that's, just kind of sailing around and not really employed in migration or drugs or whatever. So I think that's what you're trying to get at.
Right, and there's no need to overdo it and to make it excessively burdensome. The Coast Guard has data collection systems in place already, but what we found is that the districts are using different approaches, where in some cases they allocate all of their hours to one mission, and in other cases they make a concerted effort to do at least a rough divvy up between where they started out and where they ended up. And so I think it's just a matter of some consistent direction about how that should be handled.
Thank you very much. I yield.
Mr. Zeldin is recognized.
Thank you,
for as
Chair.
long as he likes.
I don't even know if I'll use my 5 minutes, Chairman. How's that? Admiral, thank you for being here. Ms. Grover, thank you as well. Admiral, I had a question for you. As we discuss the allocation of Coast Guard resources, one of the concerns that I hear from Long Island boaters is with regards to the 911 calls that takes place when there's an emergency on water. The Coast Guard has the expertise to deal with maritime search and rescue, yet in many cases, 911 dispatchers aren't properly trained and don't know how to handle a serious maritime emergency. Or on the other hand, how to handle a non-emergency situation where a stranded boater might have the maritime equivalent of a flat tire. We need to ensure that the Coast Guard resources are deployed when and where they're most needed to save lives in emergency situations, but not misallocated by the deployment when not needed. I would like to commend Sector Long Island Sound, which has a great plan working with local law enforcement, 911 call centers. My question for you is with regards to this issue on a national level so that all 911 dispatchers know how to properly respond to maritime emergencies. Some of the people who speak to me on Long Island have experience in other sectors, and there are different experiences elsewhere. And obviously the most extreme example is where a 911 dispatcher might be contacting local law enforcement officials, and you're not getting notified until hours later when it might be too late to successfully complete the recovery.
Well, it's an important issue, and it has to deal with the way people communicate these days. First of all, I have to encourage boaters to use their VHF FM radio, because when they broadcast it broadcasts out broadly to other people, including other good Samaritans who may be in the neighborhood and be able to render assistance to them. When they make a 911 call, I'm not telling them not to, but when they make a 911 call, it just goes to one person, and the other people who may be in the vicinity and be able to best provide assistance to them, if they don't know about that, then they may be putting themselves at risk. So I'd encourage boaters, use your VHF radio. I'm not saying don't use your cell phone, but use your VHF radio, because there may be people in the immediate vicinity who may be able to come and help you. But we understand people communicate in various different ways. They carry their cell phones with them. It is a known gap. I'm glad you point out the fact that at Long Island Sound, I know other sectors are dealing with the exact same issue. And we got the message, and I don't know where we stand on national direction on this, because it's been left down to the district and the sectors to do this. But I'm going to take a round turn on that, Mr. Zeldin, and I will get back in touch with you with exactly what our program is. But again, I encourage boaters, please use your VHF radio, because your nearest help may actually be very close by.
Yeah, and where you have a local law enforcement, fire department, EMTs, they have a maritime asset that they look forward to the opportunity to be able to utilize, obviously preferring a training setting than real life. I think that not only is there a need to better train that 911 dispatcher, but also do more to encourage local law enforcement, encouraging those first responders to contact you sooner. Is this a real issue? Because I've heard these anecdotal stories from people who are actually, in the industry. We have CETO is headquartered in my district. The 1st Congressional District of New York is a district almost completely surrounded by water, making it unique from that respect as well, and a heavy Coast Guard presence. But it seems like there might be an issue where even that first responder, when they get the phone call, they're not contacting you right away. They're trying to go out and do it themselves.
It doesn't surprise me, and again, it's the method of communication. So, sort of before the advent of cell phones, you had your radio, and everybody would monitor that frequency, as the fire department or the Coast Guard or other boaters in the area. They'd be on Channel 16 and they'd listen to things. Everybody got all the information all at one time, and they could all sort of respond as needed to that particular circumstance. Now you've got a point-to-point communication where you've got, a boater in distress, and they're calling somebody who's in some call center, 911, and you've got a point-to-point communication. Then how do you build out that back-end piece to get all those people who under the old regime would have had access to that information real time? That's a real challenge, and that's again why I encourage boaters, please use your VHF FM. But we need to build in that back-end piece, Mr. Zeldin, and I need to get you a report on how we're going to deal with that nationally. I know we've dealt with other similar issues in the past, like using some of the star features on cell phones and things like that, but how do we really get that point-to-point communication to get to all those as real-time as possible? It doesn't surprise me that you're getting anecdotal information that's hard to convert that point-to-point communication, get that to everybody all at the same time, because that network probably does not exist where it does on something like VHF FM.
Thank you, Admiral. Thank you, Ms. Grover. Thank you for the time. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I'm going to hit this one more time. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said that the biggest threat to the United States right now is Russia. It's not ISIS. They don't have a Navy. They don't have an Air Force. They have no nukes. They have nothing. It's Russia. The biggest threat, arguably, to the United States post-World War II into when the Soviet Union became Russia was Russia, right? So let's just call it Russia. So it went on for 40 or 50 years, and now it again, according to our chairman of the Joint Chiefs right now, Dunford, Russia is the biggest threat that the U.S. has. If a war started with Russia, with our allies or with us, we would be unable to traverse north of them at all right now. Would you agree with that assessment? They would have, let's put it this way. Would the Russians have free passage?
The Russians have a very capable ice-breaking fleet. I don't want to speak for the Russians, but there are very few areas that I don't think the Russians could go to. I will tell you this, and I testified this before, that with the current ice-breaking fleet that we have, we cannot, as a nation, provide global, insured, 7x24 by 365 access to ice-covered regions worldwide. We cannot do it with today's fleet.
Okay, well, but I'm just trying to go down. Why is it so important that we provide 24 by 7 by 365 global ice-breaking capability?
Sir, as I said before, if you cannot provide national presence, you cannot assert national sovereignty and national sovereign rights, whatever they may be, whether they're resource-related rights, whether they're freedom of navigation rights, whether they're national defense rights or otherwise. If you can't get there because you've been area denied by the environmentals, you cannot assert sovereign rights. And the United States has sovereign interests in both the Arctic ice-covered regions as well as the Antarctic ice-covered regions.
So let's go back to this. During the Cold War, when the Russians and U.S. Submariners were chasing each other around the oceans, we had access to the Arctic north of Russia during that entire time without having a heavy icebreaker.
Sir, I can't go back and say why they built the fleet that they did.
No,
they may not
what I'm
have even
saying
had
is,
the capability of building a heavy icebreaker.
They had the capability.
I don't know whether they had the capability in the 1960s to build a vessel like the Polar Star. As a matter of fact, to get the horsepower requirements necessary to do what they did with the Polar Star, they had to use gas turbines and controllable pitch propellers, which are very, for that type of environment, probably not what you want to choose. They may not have had global insured access back in those days, sir.
Hang on, I'm not saying the capability to build the ship. We had the capability to break the ice in the Arctic above Russia during the Cold War without a heavy icebreaker. How is that possible?
Sir, I don't know whether that is possible. With the fleet that exists in 1960s, I do not know if they could have provided global insured access. There may have been ice regions that they were incapable of getting to. I can tell you my job today, and the comment I just had in the cooperative strategy that he signed with the CNO and the comment on the Marine Corps, that we will provide global insured access. And the Coast Guard piece of that is icebreaking. Global insured access, 7x24 by 365, requires heavy ice-breaking capability, of which the Polar Sea and the Polar Star are capable of doing that, and we've gone through that. So I don't know what the world was in 1960 where you could get everywhere in ice-covered regions. I can tell you the cooperative strategy lays that out as a task for the Coast Guard, and that's the task that I have, is to provide that global insured access, and it's our ice-breaking fleet, heavy ice-breaking fleet, that does that primarily. There are roles for medium icebreakers, but they cannot operate on that type of a basis.
Okay. Ms. Grover, I feel like I've ignored you. I don't know, I don't even know how to phrase this question really. When you look at things beyond hours of service and allocation of assets, when you look at Coast Guard mission sets and the prioritization of those missions, do you look at those things? Do you look at how the Coast Guard prioritizes its missions, and then how the assets are allocated to that prioritization?
Will we have information about what the Coast Guard's plan is for its prioritization of asset hours by mission? But I can't give you an analysis of the extent to which that's carried out because of the problems with the data.
Okay, so you can't say whether the asset allocation matches overall the mission or by mission because of the data?
That's right.
Okay. Okay. John, do you have anything else?
Mr. Graves.
Oh,
But Mr. Garamendi first. Scott.
we go to Garrett. Mr. Graves is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Admiral Rochelle, thank you for being here today, and I know that the chairman covered icebreakers a little bit. One question, perhaps, and I apologize, I was missing for a few minutes. I wanted to make sure we got an answer on. The Healy at some point is going to be going through a SLEP. Is that accurate? And I understand that in the questioning earlier, you discussed how a medium icebreaker perhaps provides an 80% solution. What happens when the Healy's in the SLEP? Because the Healy is going to be put in a SLEP, as I understand, within the 10-year window that you indicated was possible to deliver a heavy. So we then have some significant deficiencies in regard to capabilities.
No, that's spot on, and that we're going to have to figure out the timing on that, and when we're going to have to do a SLEP. You know, we've had some money. I think we had money in 16 budget. We've got some money in the 17 budget to do the survey work, and we're going to have to time that with the rest of the icebreaking fleet. It's a medium icebreaker. It's not going to meet requirements for things like Antarctica and stuff like that, but it's going to have to be timed with the rest of the fleet. I think you're spot on, Congressman Gray.
And so, Admiral, I think along the lines of the chairman's questioning, I certainly don't intend to put any words in his mouth. I think the concern is on the part of many members of the committee is sort of the interim strategy. So I don't think there's any question here that we have need for additional icebreaking capabilities, especially when you compare our capabilities to other Arctic nations. We're getting blown away right now. But for us to put all of our eggs in the basket of the heavy and the long-term strategy, it does leave a gap, particularly, and that gap is exacerbated by the fact that the Healy's going to have to go through a SLEP at some point during that 10-year window. And I think that the interim strategy is something that's a concern of many folks here. So can you remind me, when is the survey or the report due back on the Polar Sea?
So I told the committee that, as the Commandant promised, on July the 24th, we'll have the material assessment on the Polar Sea. That will not include the entire alternatives analysis, which is kind of what we get the broader context. But the material assessment is due to the committee on July the 24th. We had folks out there looking at it when it was out of the water, and I anticipate we'll deliver that report on time.
Great. Thank you, Admiral. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Yeah, so we have a hearing on July 12th, but July 24th is when we're going to get and we're not going to be here. I'm not sure we come back till September after so we're not going to be here to hear what the update is on the Polar Sea, but we can get that out to everybody when it comes in. We'll push it out. So thanks. I'd like to yield to the ranking member.
Admiral Michelle, thank you very much. We've gone into icebreakers in great detail. We'll do that again on July the 12th, and we'll pick up other pieces of this. You've got an extraordinarily complex world and many, many missions in which you have to deal. My fundamental concern is that we have the information necessary to give you the money and the resources necessary to carry out the tasks. I recognize that those tasks, the prioritization of changes over time. There are emergencies, there's Deepwater Horizon, and suddenly you're off to a different task, or there's a hurricane and whatever. So I understand that. I want to make sure that you're positioned for the future. The icebreaker is a 10-year project, I understand that. Many of these other programs are also going to be long-term projects. I want to make sure that you're starting today or you're underway today with the resources you need for the future personnel and the assets that they will need. We've talked some about unmanned aerial vehicles, of aerial as well as surface and marine. We don't want to go into that much more detail. Of specific interest to me is the integration of the total American assets. So the Coast Guard is able to integrate with the military. I know you do much of this already in cybersecurity and other areas, some of which are classified. But there's much, much more. that's available there. I know the State Department is working on a program having to do with the fish in the ocean, or the fish that are no longer in the ocean. And that's another task that the Coast Guard has. So the integration across the whole of government is of great interest to me, so that we can better utilize and integrate the resources. So the next conversation that I would like to have with you, and some of this is in the ice-breaking area, is the integration across the whole of government. I don't expect an answer today. I am going to have some questions, if the chairman would allow, that we could get in written form and get some answers back, and David will get those to you. Mr. Chairman, thank you for this hearing, and Admiral Michelle, Ms. Grover, thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Hey, thank you both for being here. As Mr. Garamendi said, we're trying to, number one, you have the responsibility of breaking ice north of Russia. That's right now a Coast Guard responsibility. You know, Mr. Garamendi and I are both on the Armed Services Committee. Maybe that needs to be a Navy responsibility, because right now there's a giant gap where we're unable to break ice north of Russia. From the Bering Sea north and west. We can't do it right now. You don't have the capability to do it for a sustained amount of time at all. So the question is, number one, should it even be a Coast Guard responsibility? If it's a national strategic priority, should it be a Coast Guard responsibility, or should we just go, Navy, do it? Build them, do it, make sure we have the capability to be up there, to break something out of the ice, or to move there if we need to or want to. We're just trying to help you get there. Wars don't come on our acquisition timelines. Wars don't match our 12-year outlook. Wars happen when they happen, and right now we're not prepared for one. This is a big gap. And this is why the Navy's looking at this finally. This is why the Senate just put in $1 billion. This is why the House, the stingy House, just appropriated $150 million. This is becoming more and more, it's becoming clearer day by day that we have to be up there, and people are finally starting to understand that, right? So that's the good side, I guess, is that we've been yelling loud enough and knocking on enough doors to where now it is a priority. So no matter how it plays out, at least it's going to be there at some point going forward. When it comes to the unmanned aerial systems, any way that we can help you leverage your current assets, that's what UAS does. It helps you leverage what you have. It's not the be-all, end-all, but it makes the rest of your assets that much better at what they do, because instead of having to use a helicopter or a C-130, you can send that out there and you can do reconnaissance, you can do all kinds of stuff. I mean, massive leveraging of your assets, right? We just want to get there in this lifetime, on budget and on time. And anything that we can do to help you, we will do, but we need to know from you what you want. And I know you're doing analysis, but it's not like unmanned aerial systems are new. They aren't a new thing, especially a land-based unmanned system. You talked about Predator B. General Atomics has given us a price sheet, because we've asked them, what would it cost for the Coast Guard to maintain an organic fleet of 2 Predators land-based? What would it cost? $20 million for one. That's with them operating, flying for you, putting it out wherever you want. There's an actual cost for you. If you get 2, it goes down. If you get 3, it goes down more, right? That's how it works. But these systems are out there, and they're available right now. It doesn't take a whole bunch of research or analysis to go, man, what do we have now? You know, what can we buy and put in our arsenal? We have them out there. They've been tested, tried, and true, right? So those exist right now, and they're not super expensive. I mean, $20 million for one. When it's operated by somebody else, you don't have to incur any operational costs. No maintenance costs, no parts costs. That's just General Atomics operating a Predator B for you. That sounds like a good deal to me. We could probably find $20 million for that. We're just here to help. So we're going to keep pushing on these things, but we can't help you unless we get the answers from you of what you need. And it seems like it's always the analysis is being done, the analysis is being done, the analysis is being done. We're finally going to get an answer on July 24th on one of these analyses, but we are here to help. You let us know what we can do and what we can provide you to make you better at your job. So thank you for your service. I just saw the movie by the way, what was the movie with the Star Trek guy? The guy who started in Star Trek, what was the finest hours? Yeah, fantastic. Those cutters look pretty old too, right? I think you're always operating with less than you should operate with, but that's what happens. That's how we go to war. It's how we fight. That's how we go to sea. We just get the job done with what we have. So thank you very much to you and your men and women. And Ms. Grover, I'm sorry I didn't have more questions for you. I got caught up in this whole national security thing today. But I appreciate it. And with that, the hearing's adjourned.